Have you ever struggled with knowing which book of the Bible you should begin with? Do you have to read it all the way through, or can you jump around? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you a few tips to help you to understand how the Bible is formatted and where you should start. So first off, you don't have to start in the first book of the Bible for it to make sense. Although we call the Bible one book, it's actually 66 books put together to make up the Bible. So if you start with one book at a time, you will actually learn how to read the Bible better than most people. The Hebrew Bible, or also known as the Old Testament, is important to understand the deeper roots of what Jesus did in the New Testament and why he did it. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, is actually all the promises that God gave to Israel. And the New Testament is all these promises being fulfilled. So another way to look at it, the Old Testament is everything before the life of Jesus. The New Testament records Jesus' deeds, his works, his words, his death, resurrection, also how the church continued that mission. It's beneficial to start in the New Testament. I would recommend starting in one of the Gospels. The Gospels are stories and the words that Jesus said to his very first followers. So me personally, one of my favorite is the book of Luke. I like the book of Luke because he writes as a historian, researching and talking to the eyewitnesses about what Jesus said and did. The book of John is one of the most theological, dense books in the New Testament. It's actually 90% different than all the other Gospels. Matthew and Mark are good as well, and you can't go wrong with any of these. After the Gospels is the book of Acts, and then you get into epistles, which is a fancy word to mean letters that Paul and other disciples wrote to the churches. 1 Corinthians is a good book to find out what the early church was doing, some of the issues they had, and how they should use their spiritual gifts. It also talks about what happens when there's no order, or when we use our gifts and think our gifts are more important than people. If you want to start with the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, one of my favorite books is the book of Psalms. This is a lot of poetry of people expressing their emotions to God when they're depressed, when certain things are not going their way, when things are going good, and praising God and seeing God in the midst of even their worst trials. You could also start with the book of Genesis, where it talks about how God created the heavens and the earth, and then it gets into the fall of man, and the story of God's redemption starts there. The book of Exodus is a great book to talk about leading the people out of slavery and out of bondage into fulfillment and promise. So I recommend you start off with one book at a time. If it's a gospel, if it's Old Testament, New Testament, whatever book it is, I suggest you start off in one book and read it all the way through, taking notes. And if you actually want to know how to do a simple basic Bible study, you can watch this video next. So you don't have to start in the book of Genesis in order to understand the Bible.